Professor Dr. Sami Al-Arian, welcome in this meeting, and thank you for having you here as a special guest in the Asia Middle East Forum. So, actually, the main question, if the Palestinian cause had witnessed the struggle for more than 70 years, how could be a new vision towards the struggle of Palestine?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your generous introduction, and thank you for the for this invitation by Asia Middle East Forum, and thank you, Dr. Balawi, also for inviting me. My talk today would be divided in two parts. The first part basically is the background regarding the struggle. In other words, I'd like to answer the question, how did we get here? And then the second part, we'll talk about where we go from here, about the vision or the future. For centuries, the world witnessed two Jewish communities. One Jewish community lived under the word of Islam or what were called Jews of Islam, as Bernard Lewis and Ismail Farouqi once called them, and the Jews of Christendom. That is those who lived in the Christian West and Russia. Ever since the Constitution of Medina in the first year of the Islamic calendar, Jewish communities and tribes in Arabia were recognized as intrinsic part of the Ummah or the community. For centuries thereafter, Jews lived in peace and security with Muslims and other faith communities throughout the Arab and Muslim world, creating what the Jewish Encyclopedia would call the Jewish Golden Age. We talk about Jewish philosophy, culture, scholarship, and science. On the other hand, Jewish communities in Europe lived for centuries in ghettos, where they were discriminated against, ostracized, marginalized, and barely tolerated. The list of the social, legal, and religious incapacities and vulnerabilities is very long. Every new Christian ruler or emperor would add to it from time to time. The prohibitions and restrictions imposed in these Jewish communities in Europe were enormous and increased over time. Unless the Jewish communities lived in their own ghettos, they may not employ Christians, they may not disinherit their children who convert to Christianity. They must convert if they marry a Christian. They shall be ruled by Roman law rather than the Torah. They shall not criticize Christian doctrines nor give evidence against Christians, and on and on and on. They cannot refrain from eating pork if they are outside their ghettos. They shall submit to Christian practices. They can be punished if they work on Sundays and so on. But the modern history of Europe or Western Jews is certainly intertwined with modern European history. So when Europe came out of the Middle Ages in the Age of Enlightenment, let's say the 17th and 18th century, where intellectual life was animated, created, where science and culture blossomed, while church dogma rather gave way to reason. It was then that the European Jew, who existed for centuries on these sufferance, living in their ghettos, they felt that they were finally emancipated. As they came out of their ghettos, they had to learn the new languages of those people who were mixing with them. They thought that they now can mix and be part of society, assimilate. This is called the great assimilation of that Jewish generation. But even many religious leaders or rabbis they started reinterpreting their traditions so that they can conform to this new lifestyle. But even after the French Revolution and after the secularization of the assimilated Jew, they had to endure hatred and suspicion. And this was noticed or observed particularly by the founder of modern political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, when he witnessed firsthand as a journalist when he covered the Alfred Dreyfus affair or trial in Paris in 1894 towards the end of the 19th century. And from that moment, he felt, this was, by the way, a soldier who was accused of treason by the French because of his faith, and he was certainly railroaded, and he was tried and convicted without much evidence because he was a Jew, and that prompted Herzl to start the Zionist movement. And despite the enlightenment of Europe, they could not assimilate, or they could not fathom the Jewish community, and that came with this notion of anti-Semitism, and of course that was in addition to the pogroms that were taking place on the other side of Europe, in Russia particularly. So this is the essence of the Jewish. It was a Jewish problem in Europe, suffered or promulgated by racist Europe. And they thought in the age of imperialism and colonialism that one of the ways to get rid of their Jewish problem, but also to further their colonialist goals, was to create a state, but particularly after the emergence of the Zionist movement, the modern Zionist movement in Europe, and they found common ground. They would aid it, they would support it, they will adopt its program by creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine at the expense of the indigenous population, who were, Palestine was not empty. It was already, it already had its own population, indigenous populations, the Palestinians. And of course, we're talking about towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, towards the beginning of the 20th century, and colonial Europe wanted to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and to fragment its different countries. Well, it was really provinces, particularly the Arab provinces, and we know all about the Sykes-Picot Accord, where France and originally was France, Russia, and England, but of course Britain and France, after the Russian Revolution, they did it in 1916. 1917 was the Russian Revolution. At any rate, and part of that was the Balfour Declaration, when Britain particularly gave that particular declaration to establish a modern Jewish state in the heart of the Arab world, in the heart of the Ottoman Empire in Palestine. So that is the background where it shows that the original problem was not something internal strife. What we're talking about here is racist Europe could not fathom its own Jewish communities, and it found in its colonialist pursuit common ground with the Zionist movement that wanted to go and colonize and settle in Palestine by bringing as many Jews in the world to the land of Palestine. And that was at the time where, geopolitically speaking, the Ottoman Empire was on its decline. And there was, in the aftermath of World War I, the dismantlement of the Ottoman Empire and the fragmentation of the Arab world, and the implantation under the British mandate in Palestine, Jewish communities, illegal immigration, in order to give them the opportunity to establish such a state. What happened afterwards is that, and I'm not here trying to give you the whole history, I'm just trying to get you the high points of how we got here, is that the Palestinian people did not obviously agree to this program. It was despite of them under occupation by the British from 1918 to 1948, which is the British mandate, 30 years, by which time massive Jewish immigration came to Palestine. I want to note here that towards the end of the 19th century, the number of Jews in Palestine were hardly 2.5%. And then that number kept rising to about 20% in the 1920s, and they reached about 33%, about 1/3 of the people who lived in Palestine, in historical Palestine, by the time of 1948, in the aftermath of World War II, when the Jewish communities were strengthened and they had their own army and their own institutions. And of course, the idea at the time was to establish a state for Jews in the fulfillment of the Balfour Declaration. There were many historical facts at the time where the internationally speaking Britain, after they allowed the Jewish immigrants to take up arms in Palestine and to establish their own kibbutz and their own towns and settlements. And to reach that stage, there were at the time several international commissions coming to Palestine, and the idea was to divide Palestine into two states. So the idea of a two-state solution was very early on, because it was one state. It was the Arabs and Muslims and Christians living there. The Jewish came from outside in the fulfillment of the Zionist project. And the idea was to separate them into two separate states, even though the Jewish communities or the Jews at the time did not, after all the different schemes by the Brits and the others to give Jews some land to the Jewish agency, all they owned at the time on the eve of the 1948 catastrophe was about 6.5% of the entire land of Palestine, while the 93.5% were supposedly under the control of the Palestinians. And they were given by the United Nations. And of course, this particular way of how they were divided is highly questionable. People didn't know much about the land or even the struggle. They were given 55% after much pressure by international great powers. And that 55% grew after the Jewish militias started starting war against Palestinians. And at the end of 1949, during the armistice, they had 78% of the land. That's almost 50% more what they were allotted at the time. And of course, the Palestinians were not able to defend, because the Brits had very stringent rules about how much arms anybody who owned a gun at the time could be subject to execution. There were several Arab countries at the time. They are mostly liberal in the sense of Western liberal notion. They failed miserably to face up to the challenge. There were many many rulers who had been either directly colonized, countries directly colonized, or these people were under the control of the colonialist powers, whether it was Egypt, the Brits were, or the British were occupying Egypt at the time, or even the head of the Jordanian army, because Jordan was also a creation of the British in order to separate from the Ottoman Empire, was even a British general. So as one of the political consequences was that these Western-oriented liberal governments that were defeated in 1948 and lost 78% of Palestine, very soon they were replaced with, in many instances, revolutionary socialist type regimes like we saw in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya over time. And they came, many of them, asking to be legitimized through their struggle on Palestine. And there were several times where the Israelis were trying to expand, and I will come to that in my second part of the speech. But the 1967 war was a more devastating war, because there the land of Palestine was totally lost to Israel, and those regimes also lost legitimacy during that, which gave rise to the Palestinian national movement. Now, the Palestinians who were under British occupation, and then they were scattered as refugees. 60% of Palestinians who lived in Palestine in the 1948 areas were expelled from Palestine by Jewish militias, and they went into several refugee camps from neighboring countries, particularly Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, which was under Jordan at the time. And eventually, those people took up arms and resistance. Obviously, they were in shock of this general catastrophe. But they were not very effective. It took a lot of time for them to organize. While Palestinians who remained in the 1948 areas were about 150,000, they were under military rule until 1966. For 18 years, they were under military rule. And curfews subject to all kinds of law. Now, by 1967, Israel expanded again. They occupied not only the rest of Palestine in the Gaza and West Bank, but also Sinai and the Golan Heights. It was a huge defeat to those regimes. Again, they lost legitimacy, and as I said, it gave rise now to the Palestinian National Movement. PLO, Liberation Organization, was a creation by the Arab regimes, by the Arab League back in 1964, 3 years before the 1967 war. And the idea of the Palestinian Liberation Organization from the Arab regime's point of view was to give the Palestinians, basically to give up the struggle and give it to some Palestinians in which they could supposedly work on Palestine rather than give that particular task to the Arab regimes as it had been before it was created, but it was still controlled by pretty much the Arab regional system through the Arab League. But after the defeat, that gave rise to the Palestinian resistance movements, particularly Fatah and PLFP, the Popular Liberation for Palestine, and the Popular Front and the Democratic Front, and so on, and other secular groups. And they took over quickly the PLO, and it became more representative of the different resistance movements. And they kept, obviously, the pressure. It wasn't a strategic threat to Israel, but yet it kept the struggle alive. It kept the Palestinians now were more engaged directly in resistance, fighting against this settler colonialist state. And that kept on. And of course, Israel mobilized its different capacities through whether internationally or regionally in order to pressure the Palestinians. And within a few years, they were again kicked out of their front status in confronting Israel, whether in Jordan in 1970 or in Lebanon in 1982. So by after 1982, it became clear that there was not any confrontational states, particularly after the 1973 war, which did not end in any major change as far as lands are concerned. In fact, they were able to entice the Egyptians by taking them outside the equation of the military struggle by withdrawing from Sinai under very restrictive conditions by which Egypt lost pretty much its sovereignty over the Sinai by pledging that they will not have, it will be basically demilitarized Sinai, so that it will not become a military threat to Israel. And by that, they took off Egypt from the formula, and that gave Israel the feeling for the first time in its existence that now it can settle and concentrate on Palestine and not fear any existential or military threat from the largest Arab country, Egypt. So by the mid 1980s, now we had the liberal Western-oriented Arab regimes defeated, replaced by socialist revolutionary type who were defeated in '67, replaced by Palestinian National Movement, which now was taken away from any confrontational state because they were exiled and disarmed from Lebanon and Jordan, and they no longer pose any kind of threat, even marginal one. And that gave rise to the resistance inside the occupied territories, which started in the first Palestinian Intifada between 1987 and 1991, where the first time Israel had to face massive uprisings from the people under occupation, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank. And it was very difficult for them to control it, especially Israel depends on, Israel is a military state, which basically any able body is part of that army, but they will be on reserve because they will also be working as civilians, as citizens, to grow the economy of the state. So when you have a permanent state of instability or war, that puts a lot of strain on its economy. So they had to reach some kind of accommodation. All along, Israel never wanted to recognize a two-state. They were always rejected it, and you can go through the literature. I mean, somebody like Ilan Pape wrote tremendously many books about this and spoke about this and wrote extensively about it. So you can go and look at all the different times where Israeli leaders, whether under Labor, supposedly the left center, or under Likud and the right wings, they never really were willing to entertain any kind of a real two-state solution. But after the Intifada, they wanted to rebrand the confrontation. So that gave rise, of course, in the aftermath of the first Gulf War. The Gulf War, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, was a strategic situation for the United States. So they wanted to get all the Arabs on their side in order to kick out Saddam. And they pledged that somehow they will start a peace process to solve or resolve the Palestinian problem. So they went through that, and of course, it was Shamir at the time who was prime minister, who never intended, as he confessed later on, to buy time in order to settle the Palestinian territories. The PLO, because it gambled on Saddam Hussein, was pretty much marginalized, and they were not part of the process. So they went secretly behind the official negotiations that were taking place in Washington, and started a process to somehow explore the situation with Israelis. It was Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres from the Labour Party who were conducting these, and that ended what's called the Oslo process in September 1993, in what was called the Declaration of Principles, where Palestinians, in the form of their leaders of the PLO, Yasser Arafat and his cohorts, they recognized Israel on 78% of historical Palestine, in exchange for Israel just recognizing the PLO as the main interlocutor, the main negotiator with them on the issue. And they postponed all what is called the final status issues. In other words, they never pledged to recognize a state for Palestinians or sovereignty or any kind of Palestinian rights. They postponed all these, the five major issues, meaning Jerusalem, the right of return for the Palestinian refugees, who incidentally had a UN resolution back in 1949 recognizing their right to go back to their lands that they were exiled from, kicked out from. So it was Jerusalem, the right of return, settlements, sovereignty, and land. All these issues were never resolved in the Oslo process. The idea was within 5 years they will negotiate, and the framework was that within 5 years there will be two states, supposedly, one Jewish and one Palestinian. Of course, that never happened because Israeli leaders never really contemplated any kind of equal status and two states. And throughout, they were buying time, and while they're buying time, they were settling Palestine. Even the freeze on so-called settlements was never part of the declaration. Israel would, from time to time, refrain from settlements for a few months or a couple of years, but then would resume. So we went from 125,000 on the eve of the Oslo Accords in 1993 to now almost close to 750 or 800,000 settlers, about 6 times the number of settlers in Palestine, which, after we see what happened, in addition to the so-called the deal of the century, or what I call it, the steal of the century, the two-state solution is dead. It's absolutely dead. Now, Israel had a choice throughout this process. They had to choose 2 out of 3 things: being Jewish, being democratic, or having the land, the entire land of Palestine. If they choose being Jewish and democratic, that would have been what is called the two-state solution. In other words, we're going to have the majority of people living in the 78% of the land being Jews. Obviously, 20% are Arabs who were left back in 1948. But we will have the majority as being Jewish. We will try to have a democratic society as they claim to have, which is obviously not true, and we can argue about that and give all the evidence why it is not democratic, and give up the lands of the 1967, and therefore Palestinians can have their own state, and that would be what is called the two-state solution. But they never opted for that. The settlement movement, the settlers, were started during labor, and they continued throughout the process of Oslo, whether it was ruled with labor or Likud, it didn't matter. It was always growing. And then they had the option of being a one-state solution, by which case you're gonna give up being Jewish, because obviously you have now more Palestinians actually in the historical land of Palestine reside today than Jewish communities. But you're gonna keep the land, and then you have the problem of one man, one vote, is that eventually Arabs could actually, and they do now, outnumber Jews, and that will severely restrict or even end the Zionist dream of having a Jewish state in Palestine, and they rejected that. So the only choice left is that you want to have the being Jewish and having all the land, which ends up with being an apartheid regime, which many countries around the world are horrified that they have to defend and support an apartheid regime. But that's basically what they do. But the fourth one, of course, is what they're trying to convince the world of having, and that is to have to being Jewish, democratic, and having the land by arguing that the Palestinians will have their own cantons, their own Bantustans. We're going to go back to the South Africa notion of Zululand, where Palestinians can rule and make sure that they will get rid of their garbage and take care of their policing within their own communities, but nothing substantial. The problem, of course, on the Palestinian side is that their Palestinian leadership since 1993, particularly after the ascendance of Mahmoud Abbas to become the president of the Palestinian Authority, have gambled. They put all their cards on this process that somehow they're going to end up with a two-state solution, and they failed miserably. So that's where we are right now. We are at the point where the Palestinians have lost in terms of their dependence on the international community or on the United States to deliver a two-state solution. We have seen in the so-called deal of the century, the contours by which the United States have been pushing and adopting basically the Zionist narrative. So on one hand, they said that Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel, eternal capital of the state of Israel. So that was taken off the negotiating table. Then they said there are no right of return because there are only a few thousand refugees. We don't need UNRWA, the agency that has been taking care of the Palestinian refugees, many millions of them around the world since 1951. We're not going to support anymore. Was quarter of its budget was coming from the United States. So there are no Palestinian refugees to talk about. In terms of settlements, we're going to recognize all the settlement activities that have taken place since Israel occupied 1967 Palestinian territories. That means about 30 to 40% of Palestinian land they will occupy, and they will settle, and they will actually recognize. And Israel could annex, and that's basically the whole thing about the annexation of Palestine, including even the Jordan Valley for security or strategic reasons. So that did away with any kind of borders. And of course, there is no sovereignty because whatever formation of Palestine is not really a state. You can call it an empire if you like, the Palestinian empire, but it really doesn't have any notion, because the first condition of any political entity is sovereignty, and the Palestinians will have no sovereignty. They cannot control the borders. They cannot have sovereignty over their airspace or their territorial waters or any kind of even land, except those that Israel is willing to give, which is basically a few cities here and there, about 7 or 8 cities, and few villages, and they will be connected through tunnels and bridges and roads and so on and so forth. So all final status issues have been negotiated between the Israelis and the Americans have adopted all the Israeli notion. Even those who are on the right of Netanyahu reject even the deal of the century, arguing that Palestinians should get nothing, and therefore they even do not recognize this, because it could actually potentially bring Palestinians to demand certain rights, and they don't want that to take place. But that's, so the two-state solution is gone. The one-state solution also is unworkable, because let's assume for a moment that somehow the Israelis will come to their senses and think we don't want to be an apartheid after much pressure, so we would like to stay there as a state, and we're going to give every Palestinian in the historical land of Palestine an equal right. So that means you have about as of today, 6.7, 6.8 million Palestinians and 6.5 or 6.6 million Jews. They would have the same right. What about the 7 million who are outside? Why would they be prevented from going back? That is not justice. So my argument is that after this all historical analysis, after all what we have seen, is that our goal should be the dismantlement of the Zionist project. And by that dismantlement, I mean the whole dismantlement of its institutions and of its instruments, and that this whole project is anathema to not only to justice and the Palestinians, but to the whole region. And I don't have time actually to go through the different junctures by which the Zionist project poses a threat not only to the Palestinians, but even to the Jewish religion itself, because it transformed Judaism from being a great heavenly religion into an ethnic group that is concerned about territorial monopoly and colonization and settlement. Zionism is a settler colonialist state that wants to get rid of its the Palestinians, the indigenous people, and replace them with other people. And that should not be allowed, and that should not be celebrated in any way, shape, or form. Now, what should be our project? Our project, frankly, as I said, once we define the conflict the way it is, the way it has been, the way it started, there will be several consequences. The first is that these are the principles by which we have to adhere to as we try to bring a new vision to the struggle or to the problem of the Middle East today. First, that the Palestinian people should have we should restore the rights of the Palestinian people in its entirety, whether they are inside or outside. The Zionist project is based on the annihilation of the other party, is that they want to get rid of the Palestinian, which is the body of the crime, from the occupied territories. They want to they would like to get rid of them. That happened in 1948. They were successful, even though they couldn't get rid of everybody. Today, the 20% Palestinians. But that is the aim. And we can go over all the leaders and the literature, the Zionist literature. There is plenty of evidence to show that we cannot restore these rights unless that project is totally dismantled. The second principle is that this struggle is much larger than the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people, even though they have been the vanguard, as the head of the people who have been fighting and resisting, and by their own presence on Palestine have been able to preserve this conflict. They haven't been able, Zionism has not triumphed simply because the Palestinians are still there in large numbers, because we are not going to repeat the mistake. You know, our grandparents who fought, but they were under colonialist Britain, they were forced to get out of Palestine, thinking that somehow they will come back in a few weeks or a few months. That mistake will not be repeated. The Palestinians are there to stay, and today they number, as I said, more than the Jews inside historical Palestine. So if it wasn't for the Palestinian steadfastness and resistance, we would not be talking today about the eventual dismantlement, as I presented, of the state, because that problem would have been solved a long time ago. But that's not the case. But still, Israel has been maintained through many sources of power, which I will talk about shortly, and it is much more than the capacity of the Palestinian people to fight it. So we have to realize that, despite all the sacrifices and the steadfastness and the resistance of the Palestinian people, it is not enough to overcome this problem and dismantle the state. That means that we have to think about something beyond the capacity of the Palestinians. Thirdly, the Zionist project was trying, as I said earlier, to resolve or solve the Jewish problem in Europe. And they want to do it at the expense of the Palestinian people. So they put all the resources, they mobilized the whole world for Israel, for the Zionist movement to settle and to expand inside Palestine. And as in any project, it has weak points and strong points. And therefore, the Palestinian National Project must also liberate itself from being a project simply about Palestine and Palestinians, and start talking about this as a human struggle, as a just struggle for the whole mankind, that this is not simply a struggle for the Palestinian community. It's a struggle against oppression and against a global threat, not just a threat towards the Palestinians. That means that we must establish a global solidarity movement to support the struggle of the Palestinians. I want to also point out, when we talk about Zionism, that Zionism itself is not a movement that concerns itself simply with settling Jews. It needs to be a hegemon in the area. Therefore, its threat is beyond just Palestinians. Its threat is really towards the whole peoples of the area. Now, the Palestinians, the PLO, when it was established in '64, that was before the '67. Its aim was to liberate Palestine and to basically adopting the one-state solution. And what happened is, after '73, they changed that national goal into the goal of establishing a state on any part of Palestine. So that needs to be changed. That's dead now. That, with the deal of the century and with the colonization of Palestine and what we have, and the demise of Oslo, we no longer have a PLO in the way it was constructed after 1974. After 1974, they changed the political program in order to establish a Palestinian state. Now that has to change. So if we're going to talk about the PLO, then the PLO has to be redefined in its earlier years. The fifth principle is that, as I said, as in any political entity, as in any social movement, the Zionist entity, Israel, since its start, has imperatives, has strategic imperatives which will keep it, will sustain it, will make it survive and thrive. The strategic mission for us in our new vision, in our new project, is to understand these imperatives. What are these imperatives that will make Israel stay, survive? And then we have to nip it at the bud. We have to deal with them. As we weaken these strategic imperatives, the state will be weakened, and a bit by bit it will collapse. And we have abundant of evidence about states that collapse without even firing a single shot. Sometimes violently, sometimes non-violently. Nazism had ended violently, but the Soviet Union has not. It collapsed completely. The apartheid regime in South Africa collapsed without even firing a shot, because it is not sustainable, and the people were able to resist it and know where its strengths are, and they concentrated on that until it totally collapsed under its own weight. The sixth principle is that in the heart of this project, in this vision, is that there will be a much larger role for peoples, not just for the elites. The peoples across the region and the world, they will be part and parcel of confronting this project in struggling against it. It's not going to be simply the Palestinian people, but there will be two main main aims. One is to support the steadfastness of the Palestinian people, because if they stay in Palestine, if they survive and continue to resist, that project is not ended. That project has not triumphed. At the same time, we are going to struggle with this project throughout the world, on all fields, all geographies, on every sphere, whether it is on social ground, economic ground, political ground, diplomatically, human rights, you name it. On every level, we have to engage it academically, culturally, and so on and so forth. And that's beyond the capacity of the Palestinian people. That means we're going to engage all the peoples in the world to struggle against it. In the same way, the level of struggle happened in the 80s when we were trying to fight and struggle against apartheid in South Africa. That means, and this is my 8th point, is that the project for Palestine will have to be a global struggle. You know, we're no longer going to deal with Oslo as being a Palestinian-Israeli struggle. This now becomes a global struggle, which means we have to align ourselves as Palestinians with all people who struggle around the world to face racism and to face exploitation and to face domination and hegemony. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, it has common cause with Palestine. Even Israelis train the police that are fighting blacks in the United States and making their life miserable. The next point, the 9th point, is that this project must have a strategic plan and operational plans and build its own institutions. Some of it actually do exist, but we have to continue that. In other words, this is not something that is done haphazardly. This is something that has to be planned, and it has to have all kinds of institutions throughout the world in order to confront this threat. And my 10th point is that as the resistance, as the struggle, as the different battles taking place between these two sides, there will come a historical moment where the strategic change would take place, because the balance of power would change over time. And then one day, the same thing would happen with the Soviet Union. This project would collapse. And that's my contention. Now, my next and final part of this presentation is to discuss what are the strategic imperatives by which we can engage in order to start weakening this state, weakening this entity, the Zionist entity, Israel, which has been obviously living off many sources of power, some of them internal, some of them external. And I do not have really time. I usually give this in an hour. So all I'm going to do is just to say what they are so that we can get an idea what we're talking about. And of course, I don't even have time to discuss tactics and how we can mobilize each strategic imperative. But the idea should be clear. Each strategic imperative provides a source of strength to the Zionist entity, and the idea is to weaken it by fighting it. Now, all these 12 strategic imperatives cannot be done simply by people or by the Palestinians, as you would see. Some of them will have to be dealt with at the level of governments and states. Some will have to be dealt with at the level of institutions and possibly corporations and NGOs. Some of them could be dealt with at the level of individuals. So it's mixed with all these things. So these are the 12 that I will go over very quickly, the 12 imperatives that sustain the Israeli entity. And the idea, of course, is that we need to deal with them. The first one, what I call exclusivism. In this imperative, Zionism calls for the ingathering of all or most Jews around the world in this historic land of Palestine. Hello? Can you hear me? Did I lose you?
We are with you, doctor. Please
Oh,
proceed.
okay. I got a message saying that I got a message saying that I have been logged out, so that's why I got worried. Okay, so the first is exclusivism, and of course that failed already because the idea was to empty the state and have all the Jews, and today we can say that that's not the case. The second one is exclusion. Exclusivism, meaning all Jews there. Exclusivism, exclusion is the idea that there will be no Palestinians left in Palestine, the banishment of all or as many Palestinians from the historic land of Palestine. And as I said, today we have over 6.7 million Palestinians versus maybe 6.5. The third strategic imperative is expansion and colonization, which is Israel's manifest destiny. And in this imperative, we can show the gradual expansion of the Zionist state by seizing as much land as they possibly can over the years. We can go over and trace this from the early times when they built their first kibbutz in Palestine until the day that they occupied not only the whole of Palestine, but the Sinai and the Golan Heights, and to expand further and further. And today we could see how that state also is contracting, and what they're trying to do is within the West Bank, trying to colonize and settle as much as possible. So that's one of their strategic imperatives. And the more they lose land, the more that strategic imperative obviously is defeated. So now they are in the contraction phase rather than in the expansion phase. The fourth one is the creating facts on the ground, what we call fait accompli. It's a geopolitical term that imposes a situation in reality as opposed to being an abstract. But in this imperative, the Zionist movement is used the strategy in order to control all the land of Palestine by creating facts on the ground. And what you want to do is to reverse that. The fifth imperative is to create a garrison state, a military state. And of course, we know that Israel spends per capita the most in the world, and how every able body up to age of 50 for male and 40 for female, they are part and parcel of the military. So that's how, and again, the idea is how we can reverse that. And I know for a fact that many Israelis today, they try to fight against even serving because of many reasons. Some of them material and some of them are ideological. The sixth imperative, strategic imperative, is to develop a military doctrine by using overwhelming forces to win against any and all enemies, and to maintain military technological edge over all its rivals. And the idea was they must win all wars, to fight on enemy territories, do not fight long wars, and so on and so forth. They had these doctrines, and we could see in the past decade or so, they have failed even to win wars against movements, let alone countries. You know, we saw that in 2006 against Hezbollah and against the Islamic resistance movement and other movements in Palestine between 2008 and 2014. The seventh strategic imperative is to maintain monopoly of nuclear weapons. And we can go through the history. And of course, that is something that has to be dealt with at the level of state. You know, they try to have monopoly over this so that they can frighten the people. And of course, it's very difficult to use nuclear weapon in that neighborhood because it's going to affect both at the same, especially if Palestinians stay in Palestine. But we could see also what they did to Iraq and Syria, and what they tried to do to Iran today. This is all part of this to maintain monopoly. And what we want to do is to not allow them, but to raise the idea that they cannot have nuclear weapon in that region and enjoy this monopoly while the others are denied it. Either they can take it out from them, or everybody should have it. In other words, that could be a very dangerous world if that happens. But this issue has to be voiced. The eighth strategic imperative for the survival of the Zionist entity is that they have built the most efficient, sophisticated, and ruthless security agencies and apparatuses and intelligence operations that they need in order to control the Palestinians in the territories and eliminate the threats, the assassinations, and so on and so forth. So that also had to be confronted, because that cannot maintain. They have maybe, Ilan Pape estimates maybe 150,000 Israelis are in these agencies and try to control every aspect of Palestinians. And of course, that has also to be dealt with in order to weaken the state and confront it with its oppression and with its tyranny and with its brutal practices against the Palestinians. The ninth strategic imperative is for the Zionist state is that they have been trying to link tightly with an international, with one international power and benefactor, even if they have to serve as a client state. We saw this during the British mandate with Britain, and then in the until the 1948 Nakba, and then with Russia, Czechoslovakia, and Germany in terms of the reparations in the 50s. Then with France in the late 50s, 60s, they get most of their weapons from there. And since 1973 with the United States. So this is a very important link for Zionism, is that they cannot live without a great power, being as a leech to a great power, that they are part of great power in order to get not only political coverage and diplomatic coverage and weapons and economy, but also to have this strategic protection. And that means that we have to look at some of these countries and have strong movements within the countries, and particularly today within the United States, because that is a very important battleground state when we are confronting the threat of the Zionist state. In the 10th strategic imperative is for the United States is to keep world Jewry, Jewish communities around the world, particularly in the United States and Europe, Zionist, with their unquestionable support for Israel. And I can see that has been weakened tremendously, particularly in the United States. I lived there for many years, and I can tell you what it was basically in the 70s and what it is today is night and day. So that also is a vulnerability for the Zionist movement, because pretty soon, many Jews around the world do not want to be attached to an apartheid state. So that imperative will be weakened tremendously, and that's a strong win and an important positive development in our struggle. The 11th strategic imperative is to keep the enemy divided and weak, and to fragment the Middle East and beyond. And I can go on and on, give a whole hour about what they have been doing to the region from the early on, you know, the separation of or the division of Sudan into Sudan and South Sudan. Israel played a great role in doing this. What they're trying to do what they had tried in Lebanon when they allied themselves with certain people in order to separate Lebanon. What they did with Iraq and their role in dividing Iraq into Shia, Sunni, Kurds. What they're trying to do in the Kurdish areas. This is a plan that was written actually in black and white in 1982, which was to fragment the Middle East under the Oded plan. And you can download it and look it up, which was basically imported and was part of the strategic plan of Israel since at least 1983. But of course, we argue that this was much earlier in the 50s, even during the Ben Gurion era. The last imperative, the 12th imperative, is they will not want to become a regional hegemon by allying themselves with minorities like the Maronites, that when they tried in the 80s, and other separatists, despot tyrants. We saw their effect or their alliance with certain regimes who are against any democratic transition, particularly after the Arab Spring of 2011. Israel is part and parcel of this alliance, that they want to deny the people their rights to self-determination, the right to freedom, the right to having democratic and representative governments. All that Israel has been part of. So that it's a struggle across the region. Why do they want to do that? Because that will ensure their being their regional hegemon, because with their strategic relationship with the United States, and these regimes are afraid of because they're not representative regimes, they are corrupt regimes, tyrannical regimes, that they can lose power. So they ally themselves with Israel, that trying to keep them in power. And we can go over many examples. So let me sum up, and this is basically the end of my talk, is that when we talk about a new project or a new vision, we're talking, you know, I went through the historical analysis, is that all the different phases, throughout all the different phases of the Palestinian issue, we've seen different people leading that struggle. But it came down to a struggle for either a two-state, one state, but none really to address the original threat, which that this is a movement that is foreign. This is a movement that is coming to settle and colonize property at the expense of Palestinians. And that if we allow it to stay, the threat will never end. The threat will always be there. So our aim, our goal, our strategic goal is to dismantle the state. That's the only way we can restore rights, that the Palestinians can get back their rights, and that we can have stability and peace in the area. We cannot allow this threat to continue at this level. That means that the whole region could be fragmented, could be weakened, and it will always be in turmoil. That's the first thing. Now, how do we do this? How do we dismantle the state? And now we know that even with all the historical experience, neither the one state nor the two states are viable. So we are back to this dismantlement. Now, the way we do this is we study what are the strategic imperatives of this state, what are the sources of strength. We deal with them, and to deal with them, we cannot do it as Palestinian people. We have to ally ourselves with countless people around the world, and we will deal with this as we weaken the state. And BDS is just a tactic. It's a tool, very effective tool, that it can weaken the state in many respects. But we have to look at many other respects, to deal with these 12 imperatives. As we build this movement around the world to weaken these imperatives, to weaken the state. And I haven't even spoken about the internal problems: the Arab versus Jew, the religious versus secular, the Ashkenazi versus the Sephardim, the settler versus the city dweller, the different problems within the state itself, which will make it also shaken and crumble. So to end, what we have to do is to build this movement, deal with these, and then over time be able to weaken that state. Now, Jews were not tolerated in Europe. They were discriminated against. The Muslim world always received them when they were kicked out of Indonesia, when they were given the choices between death, conversion, or exile. They chose to come to the Muslim world. If Europe cannot take them, if Europe cannot have them, we will have them in the Muslim world, from Morocco to Indonesia, but not at the expense of the Palestinian people. They cannot stay in Palestine and colonize it and settle it at the expense of the Palestinian people. Palestinian rights have to be restored, and then they can live any part of the Muslim world, not just in Palestine. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, so we will start now to receive questions to you, Professor. If there's any question for Professor Sami regarding our topic and regarding our meeting towards the new vision of the struggle of Palestine. So we are now available to receive the questions. Any question?
Thanks, Dr. Sami, for this fruitful introduction and for this presentation. But frankly, you give us like a pessimistic view that that we are like having a very difficult situation, that we can't go through it. But still, what's like the alternative, like in reading the reality now on the ground, the Palestinian factions, the resistant armed groups, and even the Palestinian Authority, like what's like the way out of this dilemma the Palestinians are facing now? Okay, we speak about to have to enhance the work of BDS or worldwide. But still, we as Palestinians, what is the role of the Palestinian political groups? Even what do they have to do? What's like still
okay.
like this?
Okay, all right. Thank you for your question. We do not have magic. We do not have answers that will make people feel relief. This is a very difficult struggle, and it's not going to end until we pay heavy price, and we have been paying very heavy price. I laid out a national vision. Now, there are many details to that vision we haven't talked about. We cannot and I cannot talk about it in this short time. And of course, it needs a larger participation by many people. The question here is, what is our ultimate goal? If the ultimate goal is to have a two-state solution with some kind of a demilitarized state, as the Palestinian National Authority has been trying to achieve for over a quarter of a century, then you go about it certain ways, and they have been trying and they've been failing. If the idea is to have the status quo with some kind of a Palestinian relief so that we can have more relief and to lift the siege on Gaza, and we can pay certain prices here and there, then obviously you're going to approach it in a certain way. My contention here is that our goal, our ultimate goal should be to dismantle the state. If we agree in this goal, the question is, how do we do that? That's a very difficult thing, and I'm not conceding. I'm conceding that's a very difficult thing. I'm not arguing that this is a simple thing to do. It's an extremely very difficult thing to do. But mentally, we have to believe in this, and then we go to the next step. That mentally, we have to know that the ultimate goal is not to have anything called Israel. Israel is a threat, not to the Palestinians, but to the whole people of the area, to the whole region. The whole notion of having a Zionist, racist, colonialist, settler state is a threat and is danger. And it has to be dismantled. That does not mean to kill the Jews or to throw them in the sea, as some people would say. That is not what I'm arguing at all. What I'm arguing is that this notion, this state in its current structure, in the way it is constructed and existed, cannot stay. You know, this militarized state is a threat. So it has, now, once we agree on this, and I'm saying this has to be embraced by not just Palestinians, but everybody. For Palestinians, we have to support them, that they stay there. They will still suffer. They will sacrifice. That's their fate. I cannot change that, and no one can. And if people think that somehow, if you oblige to the enemy, that your conditions will change, just look at Egyptians and Jordanians today. That's the same argument that was used back in 78, 79 during the Camp David, that Egypt, once they have peace with Israel, they will be transformed into paradise, that everybody, that their misery would end, that everybody would be lifted, that there will be no more poverty, no more suffering. And what's the situation today in Egypt? They're about to lose the source that has been giving them life, the Nile, for thousands of years. And Israeli hands is not away from this. Israel's hand in the Renaissance dam is all the way in. So what I'm trying to say is that Palestinians, but we have to support them any way we can. And then we have to build these solidarity movements and to deal with these imperatives one by one. You know, how to weaken the state, how to make that state not survive, how to kill it as a state, not as people. Because I don't want people to misunderstand what I'm trying to say here. We're talking about a racist Zionist state that has to change, and in its place has to be a just system. And when we do that, that's what we have to do. We have not talked about specifics, because that's not what I can do today, you know, in the short time. But how do we deal with the issue of exclusion and exclusivism? By making sure Palestinians are there, by making sure that Jews outside Palestine understand the nature of that regime, so that they do not immigrate. So that some people can work on that. When we talk about, you know, being a military state, we're living in a military state. We need to work on those who provided with military arms and with all tools of oppression. When we talk about the survival of the state, you know, BDS is a great movement that everybody can join, and everybody can create and organize and mobilize the people against that. How we can make this state a pariah that no one can respect or deal with it on all levels. That's what I'm talking about. When talking about its security agencies, those who are brutalizing Palestinians, they need to be brought to trial. So all those who deal with the legal system around the world, we need to mobilize ourselves to bring these people to justice, whether this is in local jurisdictions or international jurisdictions. So we can mobilize this. So it's a struggle. Nothing can happen overnight. And of course, when we talk about this, the support of the Palestinian people, the steadfastness of the Palestinian people, we need to be united because they exploit us being divided. They want to have Ramallah and Gaza always separated because they can deal with us differently. They want to have the people of Jerusalem, people of the West Bank, people of Gaza, people of 1948, people of the diaspora. We need to unite them with the Palestinian people because that's part of our struggle so that we can have all united front to confront this threat.
Okay, Dr. Percy. I will take over from here. Brother Muhammad Mansour had an urgent work, so he has to go. So finally, I think we have to have 2 more questions, if there are any, and then inshallah we will conclude.
Can I have the question, please?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
First of all, assalamu alaikum to all of you, especially Ustad Sami Al-Arian. I'm Mushtaq Ahmed Wani from Indian occupied Kashmir. Right now, I'm talking from Turkey. So many things to say, but just a short. I would like to salute all the people of Palestine who are struggling for against the apartheid Israeli state. But Ustad, I would like to divert your attention to the fact that how far do Palestinians recognize the urgency of understanding the impact of Indian-Israel relationship, whether it is strategic, whether it is military, whether it is other aspects. Because we know from the August 5th last year 2019, Indian state has actually started the same settler colonial procedure in Kashmir, scrapping the Article 370 and 35A, and then many more laws have been actually passed in Kashmir, where not only the space is being made for the Indians to settle there, but also the special state is given to people, like special houses are being made for the Indian military. Apart from that, they are passing laws, so that the wine houses will be set up, the shops will be set up, so that the youth will get engaged in all these activities, so that they don't they will not be interested in this struggle. So, Ustad, my question is that first is how far do Palestinians recognize this the impact of this relation between India and Israel? We call Hanud and Yehud, and also why, Ustad, how far can we bridge this solidarity network between Palestinians and Kashmiris? We have been talking this thing before when we met, but how far do you think that we have this opportunity right now? Thank you so much for your...
Thank you for your question. Certainly, when we talk about the struggle in Kashmir and the struggle in Palestine, there is so much parallel between the two. And I've given some thoughts about this, discussing the different parallels. Your question about how much the Palestinians recognize this, I think for the most part, Palestinians do understand what's going on in Kashmir, and they do sympathize, and they think that this is a common struggle. But of course, the Palestinians are much more occupied with their own tragedy, whether inside the occupied territories where they are facing the enemy every day, the same way the Kashmiris are facing their tormentors every day. And therefore, but I think at the level of the elites, at the level of leadership, we need to have to strengthen that relationship. Because I think both struggles are struggle for justice and struggle for self-determination, for freedom, and eventually for the rights to live in dignity. Because anyone who is living under occupation or living under the rule of someone else, they lose their dignity and they are enslaved. And we are trying to bring people back to become free people rather than to be enslaved to anyone else. So there are many parallels between the two issues. Palestine is probably more widely known around the world because of its special status. But I think Kashmir is right there behind it because many people also recognize the injustice that has taken place now for over 50 years on the people of Kashmir. And I take me back to the times of the Intifada of 87. I think the Kashmiri people saw what the Palestinians did there, and they had their own Intifada actually a few months after that in 88. And I think it's been raging ever since. And I believe also that that both struggles have many parallels with each other, but we also see that how their tormentors also are cooperating and learning from each other. And what's happening in Kashmir last year was basically a copycat of what the Israelis have been doing for the past decades, and trying to settle and colonize and have these laws to change the situation on the ground, the creating facts on the ground, the same imperatives that I was talking about. And we need to reverse that. So I think the people in Kashmir, they need also their own strategic vision to put together how they're going to liberate themselves from the yoke of tyranny and colonizations and settlement.
Yeah, we have to move to the last question, because usually our lecture is about 1 hour, so we have already exceeded that. Let's have the last question and conclude. Any questions? Okay.
So Ibrahim is speaking, but you have to unmute your microphone.
May I have a question?
Yes, brother. Can you hear me? Brother, can you hear me?
Yes. I
Yes,
think
brother.
we have a room only for one question. So
Yes, can I speak? I'm from London, Dr. Kamrul Hassan.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Dr. Makram. I met him in Delhi, and thank you for very nice presentation about this issue. My question is, yes, when you look at the history, when you look at the one-state solution, when you look at the two-state solutions, and now people are talking about this road ahead. And brother Dr. Arian presented, I think, very nicely what is the future for the Palestinians, and he gave a proposal, he gave his views. But I think one thing we need to clarify a little bit, which he tried, and probably the next presentation, we need to actually explain these, if we agreed these goals, yes, for these brothers apart, for example, the Palestinians brother inside Israel, Palestinian brothers globally, Palestinian brothers in refugee in Jordan, Syria, and Gaza, and definitely West Bank, the United Front, and the global, Jewish issues. But the dismantling the project Israel, when you tell people that, then I think people misunderstood, as brother tried to explain, that they think we'll take Israel and put it in the sea. So the way he was explaining, I think that is the correct way to actually talk it out, frame it out, what we mean, if the goal is yes. Because the book, when I read about the Balfour in the dock, Zaim Jeffries and the case for the Palestinian, and I think that book, many years ago in 1930s, 40s, what they said with this journalist Zaim Jeffries, is exactly the situation is right now. So I think that we from the next talk, or from the next things, we need to explain the the actions, and the actions, when they explain the actions, then people will understand. They know we are not saying kill all the Israelis in the Israel zone, but the struggle, how we can take it internationally, nationally, and globally to implement this project phase by phase, and how to implement this. I think that will be the question for the next talk. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you very much. Let's have one more question, the last question, and then I'll leave the microphone to Dr. Sami to conclude.
May I ask
Yeah, Brother Ibrahim, go ahead. Brother Ibrahim.
No, Dr. Al-Arian, we met your last week, you remember. My question is about the Palestinian soft power. We know that it has hard power, for example, Hamas and other armed groups. You mentioned about, I have just joined you, but your last words were about BDS. But there's only BDS. I don't see any, for example, lobbying group of Palestinians in America or in Europe, or they have it, but we don't know it. Do we think that the Palestinian soft power is not so strong? It should be more developed.
Okay.
I mean, to defend Palestinian cause through non-violent ways, to media, NGOs, etc.
Thank you. Thank you for the last two comments and questions. Certainly, and I thank the brother from London. We certainly need to expand the discussion. And as I said, this is just the vision, and then we have to put the strategic plan, the goals, and the tactics, and the means, and so on and so forth. So that is something that needs to be done in the future. As for the lobbying groups, I was in the U.S., as I said, for a long time. I know the shortcomings, but I think it's a work in progress. If we look at what was the presence of any work towards Palestine 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, and compare it today, there's much progress, even within the Jewish communities. Of course, the last thing you're going to reach is a change at the political level. That's going to take more time, more effort, more resources. But I think we're much better than what we were, but we're not good enough. For any change in society to take place, it has to be done at different levels. At the level of the common people, at the public level, at the media level, and then at the political level and the judiciary level. That's when we talk about any kind of social change. And of course, when you talk about foreign causes or foreign policy, it's a little bit different, the trajectory a bit different, but it's pretty much the same. The Palestinian, we have an edge in the United States that only the Jewish communities have that edge, unlike any other foreign policy issue, is that you have a big constituency within the presence of American Muslims who are overwhelmingly pro-Palestine and pro-Palestinian issue, as well as other issues, Kashmir and others, Bosnia, for example, at the time in 1995. So we have tremendous ability to mobilize these resources, but they haven't been mobilized for many reasons. This is not the time to discuss them, but certainly we have a lot to do. And I think eventually, if we build the movement correctly, as I said, this is not a movement for Palestinians, it's a movement for Palestine. And that's a huge difference. I'm not trying to organize simply 13 million Palestinians around the world. I'm trying to mobilize billions of people across the Arab world, the Islamic world, and beyond, the whole world. And you're gonna find a lot of people who would like to be a part of that struggle because they believe in this struggle, that this is a struggle for justice. And the struggle for justice is the noblest, is the highest levels of struggles that people could be with. In the same way, that solidarity movement, that struggle for justice was able to liberate the black men in South Africa. We were able to do the same and defeat Zionism, inshallah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Sami. It was a great honor to host you. Hope to see you again, inshallah, in the future on other important topics. If you have anything to add, we would like to conclude with a word from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope today that we, if we were not on board with this vision, that we consider it, or at least embrace it or consider it. I think each one of us in their own capacity can be part of that struggle and can bring people into this struggle. As I said, being a Palestinian, obviously you are part of that struggle since the day you were born, but also everyone is being affected. So my hope is that through the Asian Middle East Forum, that we are able to continue these discussions and think of more ways by which we can link the different struggles, like what's happening in Kashmir and others, but also be more effective into trying to embrace the struggle on the ground, not just intellectually, And I think part of this would be for this kind of group to start organizing around effective ways to weaken the grip of the Zionist state over Palestine in our own geographies. Each one of you come from a different geography, and certainly there are ways to do that. So I'm hoping that we can take the ideas and take these ideas and make them more actions on the ground. That's my hope.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you again in future events. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Eid Mubarak, everybody.
Eid Mubarak, everybody.
Eid Mubarak.
Thank you very much. Eidukum Mubarak, inshallah.